So what we've done is we wanted to start with what leadership is. And Jackie, you might have seen this slide before, I can't recall, but this is a slide that we often use in our programs because we talk so much about different approaches to leadership, different mindsets, different scenarios. What we don't often talk about is what is the job of leadership fundamentally. And this comes from, this is an organisation that's based in the States, but it's aligned with healthcare. They're a great organisation. We've put the link on the bottom. And they're, oh, Gemma, I meant to say, if you want to record, you are recording, it's fine. They are a great organisation to go into and have a look at. They have very contemporary thinking around leadership and they have very current articles. But they describe the job of leadership. It's quite simple, it's three things. One is you set the direction of travel. So this is where we're headed. And COVID is a really good example of this. This is where we're headed. We may not be clear about what's going to come up along the way, but we know our main purpose, our main job is to keep our patients safe and well and to keep them and to keep our staff safe and well. Then the alignment comes in terms of all the activities that you're doing to align with that direction. And again, COVID is a really good example of that. There were things that we had to stop very suddenly. There were things that we had to start very suddenly. And then there were things that we had to continue or kind of maximize very suddenly. And then the third bit, which we think is possibly the most difficult, is keeping people with you. So keeping that commitment with you. And we're going to say a bit about that as part of this, this workshop is, how do you keep that engagement going? What do you need to do at the moment when you're having to really dig deep yourselves because it's so busy and there's so much going on? But we think that is, whether it's COVID, whether it's a crisis, wherever it is, that's essentially the job of a leader. Does that make sense? So the second thing we think about is what is stress and anxiety? And we got some content from Dr. Jo Ramsden, who's a consultant clinical psychologist. She does lots of work in this area. She's also done a webinar recently about losing your mind, i.e. how can you be familiar with anxiety and stress, but not lose your mind in the moment. So we've got a definition of anxiety, and you'll know this, as clinicians, you'll know this. Anxiety is your body's natural response to stress. It can be, sorry, I'm going to move your head up. It can be a feeling of fear and apprehension about what's to come. So we know that that happens with anxiety. What is the response to stress? Well, we've talked about it already. So I think it was Alex that talked about fight or flight, yeah? So the response to stress is innate in us. It's our survival instinct. It's nothing that we can't do anything about it. So when stress happens, one of three things happens. Fight. So we think, right, we're going to have to battle this. In the moment, we're going to have to battle this. Flight, oh, I want to be anywhere but here. Yeah, that real gut instinct. Or freeze, in terms of every bit of your brain just freezes. You do not know. I was working with a client only this week, and I asked them a very challenging question, and I saw them freeze literally in Zoom. So the camera didn't freeze, but they froze. And it was really interesting to unpick it in terms of it, just that question caused so much stress that their brain couldn't think. So they froze in the moment. The other bit that we've put in here is about performance and arousal. So we know that an element of stress is helpful to our performance. We know that. Exeter University did a study years ago about uncertainty and certainty. And they talked about uncertainty is helpful in driving a level of performance because it increases our arousal. It's really interesting. It was around the time of it's about 2012, around the time of the financial crisis. So it's a really good way of thinking about, but we also know that too much stimulus, when we're over aroused, it's exhausting. And I'm thinking about how that feels at the moment in terms of what people are going through. And then the last point is about, these are primitive responses in people based on our survival. But what about zebras? Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is a zebra will be grazing and a lion will come up and maybe bite it on the arse, forgive my language, but that's what sometimes happens. I'm thinking about, if any of you got small children, watch Madagascar, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And the zebra will run away and hopefully survive. What does it do 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later? Goes back to grazing, as if nothing has happened. Now with us, that doesn't happen. With us, something happens that stimulates our survival response. When that happens again, what tends to happen? We get the same feeling, but it's much more. It's much worse. And therefore we adapt our behavior around it. And again, you gave some beautiful examples of that in terms of trying to adapt our behavior, as opposed to reminding ourselves, which is the final point on this slide, anxiety is very normal. It happens, it's there, it's part of us. We can't avoid it, but we can learn to manage it. Does that make sense? So we can't be a zebra, sadly. We can't not completely overcompensate at times when something happens, but there is, in that moment of managing what we do, the choice we make when we're in fight, flight or freeze. Gemma.
I was just thinking as well about how different we are to zebras in that the zebra won't ever give that event another thought, whereas we would spend time ruminating over significantly. If it had been a near-death experience, it would stay with us a long time, and we would also perhaps imagine what might happen in the future that might put us at risk in a similar way. So we then get those same kind of physiological responses to triggers that aren't actually there and present. So it's almost a psychological arousal, even though the physical threat isn't there to us. And I know it's something that the compassionate mind theory, Paul Gilbert's work, they call it the tricky brain, because that's what we do. We're imagining these stressful scenarios and those same responses arise.
Gemma, that's very helpful, because that, in a few slides' time...
Oh, sorry.
No, don't be sorry. But that's exactly what this is about. Is, I guess the important bit about this is it's just remember, you are going to, when this happens, the next time it happens again, it's exactly like Gemma says, you'll be overstimulated. And that's the important point. So the management of that and the acknowledgement of that is key. Okay, I'm going to move on. Is that okay? So what we thought might be helpful is, and we'll bring all this together, what we've noticed about teams over COVID. So Nicola and I have had the luxury, and it is a luxury, of being able to be slightly outside your world, but hopefully be able to support that world in the work that we've been doing with teams. So we've seen a lot of teams over the last 12 months, and we've seen a lot of leaders over that time. And what we've noticed about many leaders, things that they are anxious about, and some of that came out in what you said, getting it wrong. Getting it wrong was huge at the start, and yet nobody knew the right. So it's incredible. Upsetting staff, that kind of psychological contract. So I'm an HR professional, and the psychological contract is more important than the written contract. So upsetting staff in terms of redeployment or the change that was associated, the quick change, that was a worry. Lack of staff, obviously, is a worry. Lack of democracy, so not being able to sit and have, 4 working parties about a change in infection control procedures. Forgive me, I'm not being facetious, because these things are really important, but in the moment you can't always talk about what would be good to do and nice to do. It's about what has to be done. Not making the right decisions for the patients. So I know that there's lots of examples where patients have not had the best care, and you talked about that, the guilt of that. Not being resilient enough. So, a sense of, we've got to battle through, we've got to keep going. I think it was it Jackie that said about that sense of, I've got to always have the answers, got to always know what I'm doing. Not being physically present and connected enough. So, there were some people in the early stages, and still are now, who had to shield, and they're very senior leaders. And so therefore they had to lead essentially with their eyes shut. That's how they described it sometimes. And trust the staff to get on with it in their absence as well, which was hard. Not knowing what they would face each day. So to some, they loved that. To lots, they didn't. That kind of, who was it who talked about control? Was that Was that Terry? Yeah. So a great example of not knowing what you're walking into was hugely stressful for some people. And another layer of anxiety from that outside world. So, you know, kids coming home from school, not coming home from school, being isolated because of all sorts of things. All that played a part in terms of what we noticed about leaders being anxious about. What we noticed about them being energized about was some of them were very energized by the pace of change. Hurrah, we can get on with it now. We don't have to go to the governance committee 9 times in a month to get this paper through. We can actually get on with it. Again, I'm being a bit facetious, in a small group. Being nimble and agile, so being able to do that really large scale change. So I was talking to a colleague recently who talked about they make different decisions, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, which I wasn't, different decisions about infection control every day based on what's coming in the door because they need to be. They've never had to do that before. New ways of communicating. This is an example today. They haven't had to do that. So the speed of that has been really helpful to some people. And being creative, less restriction. So again, what we've talked about in terms of organisations, those reinforcing mechanisms were slightly loosened. Being part of the NHS solution. So let's just remember that. Clap, feeling valued. There's loads of examples of that. Captain Tom, who we sadly lost this week. All that stuff, feeling more valued externally and being given. I remember seeing a district nurse in a car and I sort of knocked on the window and said, thanks ever so much. And she burst into tears. You know, but I would never have done that before COVID and I should know better having most of my my family in the NHS. More meaningful conversation stroke interaction. So sometimes it was about what can we do best for our patients at the moment, as opposed to, shall we fill this piece of paper in? Shall we do this particular task that's sort of eons away from our direct care? And not knowing what they will face each day energized some people. So let me pause for 1 second before we get into some of the theory. Any thoughts about that or observations or anything that connected with you? Yes, Terry, was that? Terry, then Gail.
Yeah, sorry, I can't work out how to put my hand up virtually. I think talking about sort of there being less restrictions and that sort of thing, certainly we've made some quite significant, really important changes in my service, and we've lost a lot of red tape and things have just happened, and some have gone really, really well, some haven't gone quite so well, but actually it's just made life a lot easier in some respects.
Brilliant example. And I love the fact you said sometimes it's been helpful, other times it hasn't been, but that's gone and it's different.
Yeah, and it's nice to have the opportunity to be able to, some things in particular that more staff, for example, we needed an extra reg. We've been waiting for years and they kept saying no, and then suddenly have as many as you want. It's that sort of thing. It's really made a huge difference. So I can't complain in that respect.
Thank you, Terry. Was it getting
COVID budget? That I'll just put it on the COVID budget, and you're like, so you can have whatever you want. It's just been a bit of a godsend. I think the pace of change has been something that energizes, but also it's kind of gone both ways, that fight or flight mode. Sometimes, you know, the infection control precautions, the PPE that has changed, that at one point felt on a weekly basis that things were changing. To some extent, some people found very energizing, but other people just couldn't keep up, found it very tiresome. So that bit kind of really resonated with me with the pace of change. I immediately just thought of PPE and then the constant Public Health England changes with that.
Thank you, Emma. I think we had Gail and then Gemma.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on the new ways of communicating, and certainly from our perspective within practice development, we have reduced our amount of travel hugely, because the same as a lot of other training opportunities and learning development opportunities, they've all had to go online. And I think that was something that in the initial phase caused quite a lot of anxiety, not just in us as a team who were having to basically change our whole way of working to provide the support that the nurses needed, but also for the nurses who were having to get used to the kind of new technology. But I do actually think now, when I look back at what we have achieved and what we're doing and what we're providing for the nurses now, that it really does energise me. And I think it energises the others in the team as well, because it's really successful. It's going really well. And so, yeah, I think that's a real bonus, actually. If you've got to find a positive out of all the horribleness, that's definitely one of them for me.
But thank you, Gail, thank you. And who knew that suddenly we would be, you know, digital for everything. Wi-Fi was never so important, was it? I think it's Gemma and followed by Alex.
Yeah, I was thinking about how it's been about sustaining this level of activity. So it felt like in the early stages that those that were responding to the crisis, you know, could really buy into that idea of sort of self-sacrifice to be able to do what was needed for the NHS and for their colleagues and their patients. But what I'm hearing now in the support sessions that we do is that that's not sustainable, and that level of investment and the anxiety that's gone alongside it to sustain that over this period, which is, you know, nearly a year now, is what's feeling exhausting for them. So I guess it's again back to that innate stuff, like the fight or flight. The anxiety response is there for immediate danger, isn't it? It's there for crisis management. It's not there to, this is the way we're going to be working for the next 12 months. That's not the function of it. So that's what I'm hearing now, is no matter how much people enjoyed responding to that crisis situation, and it brought out for some of them the best in them, at this stage now they're feeling a sense of fatigue.
And Gemma, you remember the arousal curve?
Yes.
I think people are absolutely on that right-hand side.
Yeah.
Where they've peaked in terms of adrenaline, arousal, performance, and now the sustainability. So that's where you need a different strategy, and that's what we're into in terms of what's the strategy now for the fatigue, for the, you know, the energy. Let's take Alex, and then I'm going to move on, if that's all right. Alex.
Hi, mine was pretty quick, really. It was listening to what everyone was saying. I was actually really warmed by the positivity that came out of it. Obviously, it's kind of tinted with a little bit of, how is this going to continue? But majority of the time, I think as nurses, we're actually really resilient, and we usually do an absolute best to find the positive, especially when we're talking to other people. And then I think if we just took some of that portraying positivity and actually made our brains think it was true, then we would actually be better. But I'm just really warmed by the fact that we've all thought of so many positive things. So thank you.
Thanks, Alex. That's a really lovely reflection in terms of, because you're right, how we think about a situation will drive how we feel about a situation. You know, the two absolutely, and how we describe that situation again will impact what we think about it. So the only other thing I was going to say is, remember, all of this will drive a set of behaviours. So if you're energised or anxious about something, you will behave in a certain way towards that. So, and people will notice that, people will pick that up. So just be mindful of that in terms of things that energise you and things that make you anxious. So what does the research say? So there's bits and bobs out there. We've taken mostly the McKinsey work. So the McKinsey work has looked at specifically healthcare over the pandemic in the UK. So what they're saying is, during this crisis, and we do use that term crisis in this webinar, what leaders need during a crisis is not a predefined response plan, but behaviours and mindset. So you've talked a little bit about this already, that will prevent them from overreacting to yesterday's development and help them to look ahead. What's interesting about the research is they talk about 2 leadership behaviours that help in a global crisis. And I love these because you've talked about it. I think it was Jackie that talked about these are my words, not your words, Jackie, stepping into a problem as opposed to stepping out of that problem and having to learn to do that a bit more. So the first behaviour is deliberate calm. That is about training your fight, flight, freeze. That's about, for a minute, I'm just going to think and be still and be calm. The ability to detach from a fraught situation and think clearly about how you'll navigate it. Again, we were working with clients recently, we were talking about the crisis, and we were talking about them developing that sense of not going straight to it. Don't go straight to the scene. Let's just for a minute think about what's going on in order to help others. Put your own gas mask on first before you go to somebody else. Deliberate calm is most often found in well-grounded individuals who possess humility but not helplessness. So their ability to think about that situation, to empathise and be curious about the situation. Again, we talk a lot about curiosity in leadership. And then the second is bounded optimism, and that can be just the word can make you think, is that just about being everything's great, it'll all be fine, come on, keep going. It's not about that at all. So it's about understanding what's going on, but knowing that the organisation will find its way through it. I really remember years ago being in a bit of a bad way about something, and I used the words, I can't cope. And my friend at the time said to me, but you are coping. And I thought, that's a really good point. Annoyingly, I couldn't come back to that. So I thought about that. But that's what this is about, is that we will get through this. And it's tough, but we will get through it. Let's acknowledge that. So that kind of sense of bounded optimism. So the kind of enablers, it's vital that leaders not only demonstrate empathy, but open themselves to empathy from others and remain attentive to their own well-being. So this isn't about dusting yourself off every day and saying, right, come on then, I'm going to be perfect today. Again, very quick story. When I had my first son, the midwife came in and said, Amy, I give you permission for this house not to look like this next time I come. Because basically what I'd done is spent the whole day cleaning the house with a baby on boob and, feeling very low and all the rest of it. So it's not about that. It's about understanding, actually, I'm a human being, and it's okay for me to have a checkpoint with my staff and with each other. It be a dynamic, it be a waltz, if you like. As stress, fatigue and anxiety builds up during a crisis, leaders might find their abilities to process information, to remain level-headed and to exercise good judgment diminish. Nicola, I think it's fair to say we've seen a lot of this with the people that we've worked with.
Mm-hmm.
So we've noticed it. We know it happens, but it happens to all of us. They'll stand a better chance of countering functional declines if they encourage colleagues to express concern and heed the warnings they're given, i.e., that they talk about how it feels, that they talk about what's going on. Investing time in their well-being will enable leaders to sustain their effectiveness over the weeks and months that a crisis can entail. And we're in a minute going to give you some thoughts about that. But well-being is absolutely at the heart of this. This is not difficult. If you're going in every day having to deal with this stuff, in whatever way you're going in with it, your own well-being has to be central to that. Okay? Any questions before I move on to the next bit? I'm really conscious we've got 3 minutes left, haven't we? Gosh.
Can I just make an observation about this well-being and note, you don't have the mechanisms you normally have. So normally after a stressful day at work, you go and meet friends, you go for a drink, you go out for a meal, all of that's gone. And so it's finding the different ways and acknowledging that. So your normal escape routes, your normal regeneration activities have been stopped because of COVID, and thinking about what do I put in place for my own well-being, and noticing that you don't have what you would normally have to help you recover after a busy day at work. I just wanted to make that observation.
Thank you, Nicola. So it's actually harder to access that stuff very often. That's a really good point. Everything's hard, if you like. Okay, so sorry, no, this is an important slide. So this is about Nicola. This is about what Gemma talked about earlier, about that managing your tricky mind. So one of the things that we know is the evidence of working with a compassion towards yourself and others has a positive impact on you and others' well-being and performance. So that is the ability to be really, really compassionate with yourself and others, not be critical, not say, how often does that voice come of, we could have done that better, or shouldn't maybe have said that, as opposed to what would you do differently? You handled that well. How do you feel about it? All these much more compassionate senses of how you talk to others. So qualities of compassion, I love these, are patience and wisdom, kindness and perseverance, warmth and resolve. And that's towards you and towards others. And that will help that's the bit about your well-being in terms of how your mind works, how you can manage your mind in a much more helpful way. And it made us think of questions, not to answer now, because I know we haven't got time, but questions to think about, which is, do you treat yourself as you would a friend or colleague? So are you kind to yourself as you are to others? Do you practice mindfulness? So what we mean by that is a state of not judging your thoughts, but letting them be around you. So those thoughts of worry or anxiety or judgment, do you allow them to be around you as opposed to drive you? Does that make sense? And then you make choices about how you respond. Do you ask for help and accept help? I don't know whether any of you follow Charlie Maxey, but all his stuff about, the bravest thing to do is to ask for help. And do you give yourself permission to be imperfect? So going back to my point about when I had my first son. So that's our content. It's whistled through because we've got no time left. It's now 12:30. That's gone so quickly. But if anyone wants to stay and ask any questions, we're very happy to have a few minutes more.